Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. If you're joining us live, my name is Rena. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I'm one of the hosts of TBQ Live, and I have with me today
Maria Chase. I am the other host of TBQ Live, and we are concluding our series on unconscious bias today, which I'm really excited to be talking about the solutions. We got close to what it was last week. This week, we're going to take it forward. So great to be here. Delighted to see everyone.
Absolutely. I could not agree with you more. This is a topic that has been quite controversial. It has been catching headlines, whether people should continue with unconscious bias training or not, for that matter. So Maria and I thought that it was a great topic for us to include in TBQ Live and talk about it and unpack it a bit more. So as Maria was saying, today is part 2. Part 1, we covered what is unconscious bias. And today we're going to talk about what you can do around it. So a very, very quick recap for you about what we covered up last time. But before that, what is TBQ Live? Now, TBQ Live is something that Maria and I co-host. We run a live session every fortnight. It is, of course, free. Everyone is welcome. The recording is shared. And it's really there for us to create a space and raise awareness and discuss solutions. And in the future, we are looking at hosting some more experts and engaging the audience. We are warming up and experimenting since the last couple of months, and we are learning as we all are doing in the virtual space. Now, the TBQ Live is very interesting as a concept. It's based on one of the 9 levers that are covered in my book called The Brilliance Quotient. What are the 9 levers? Well, you might have to go to my website. But today, one of the levers that we are covering off on which unconscious bias plays a big, big, big role is about reframing diversity. Because when I wrote the book with 20 other experts who've been featured, Maria being one of them, the question that we were trying to answer is how do we help leaders master the science and art of leadership in an unpredictable era? Now, this book was written 3 years ago, and how unpredictable are the times right now? So, one of the 9 levers that are covered that will help people master the science and art of leadership in an unpredictable world is reframing diversity, and that's where unconscious bias comes in. So, a couple of weeks ago, last fortnight, I would say, we covered the topic about what is unconscious bias. Now, we know that it exists. We know that it is being rejected by a lot of people. But we really went on to understand in that subject, and I welcome you to have a look at the recording about what it really means and how all of us human beings, as Maria says, if you have a brain, which we do, then you have unconscious bias playing in. But the question, what is it and what do you do around it? We also talked about how does this show up? And I've taken the help of one of the expert websites that are on this particular topic. You can Google it and have a look at it, and you can see when you go through the definition that there are different kind of biases. So they do show up. And when you read through the list here, or when you hear our recording or go through that website, you will recognize that these biases do exist in organizations. And the sad bit is that it is affecting organizations in the ways that are listed out on this slide, which is what we talked about last time. Now, we talked about that the question that people are asking right now is whether to do unconscious bias training or not, whether we should be doing anything about that subject in an organization or not. Maria and I suggest and we propose that you should. And there are 3 topics that we think that you need to really think about. And that's our suggestion and invitation if you want to really unpack this particular topic. And those are the 3 ones that I mentioned out there. And we're going to start with the bottom one, which is many companies explore the tip of the iceberg, not what lies beneath. And I'm going to hand over to Maria to talk us a little bit more about what exactly does this mean.
Thank you so much, Rena. The thing is, when it comes to the brain, depending on the research you look at, we are between 90 and 97% unconscious. Now, within that, I am defining the fact that actually we're not conscious of our lungs inflating or our pancreas doing whatever our pancreas does. But it's also about the fact that actually the brain takes a lot of energy. So in order to carry on and get the best out of what is basically a limited resource, which is energy, we actually do most things unconsciously, subconsciously. So it's all very well thinking, right, okay, let's look at what's going on above. But with every human being, it's what's going on below that is actually running our behaviors, our actions, and our thoughts. And it's our emotional processes that actually run the show. It's how we feel that makes the difference to how we act, how we think, and how we behave. And the brain does that for some really good reasons. This is why we are the iceberg. If we go on to the next slide, please, Rena. We are an iceberg because our brain takes, if I want to think consciously, and I always point to this part because this is where our prefrontal cortex lies, and that's where we are aware of being aware, that's where we're conscious of being conscious. That takes 20% of the body's overall resources. Even though it's tiny, it's only 4% of the brain's mass. To actually run and have that conscious thinking process, it's 20% of the body's overall resources. That's a quarter. That's so much. It's a fifth, sorry. My maths is not great on a Thursday morning. So therefore, the brain saves energy if it possibly can, especially because when the brain, this part of the brain was evolved, actually resources and food were quite scarce. So the brain does everything it can possibly to save energy, which means that what it does is, if I don't have to think about it, I'll just do it automatically. And that's where our unconscious bias lays. It allows us to shorthand the huge amount of information coming in. Lots of research says that we have 34 gigabytes of information coming in daily, which is crazy. The brain can't consciously process all of that information. So unconscious bias allows us to shortcut that and actually not think about it consciously, but act subconsciously from things like, I know this somewhat, it takes, a millisecond to work out if someone's a female or a male, and only twice as long to know race. And the reason we do that is the brain's overarching organizing principle, i.e. what it does first and foremost is to keep us alive, which means it keeps us safe. So that's why unconscious bias is unconscious. It's too energy expensive for us to think about everything consciously. So to refer back to what Rena said, people can be very resistant about the fact that they have bias. I don't have bias. I'm a modern, happy, really caring person who wants equality. We all want to think that, but we are underneath hardwired to run away from threat towards reward, and all of that is unconscious, which means that's where our unconscious biases live. So that's the neuroscience of why we have unconscious biases. I'm now going to hand over to Rena, and then we can look and explore about, okay, well, what's really beneath the surface then? If we are icebergs, if most of what we are thinking, feeling, and what's driving our functions and our behaviors is underneath the surface, what does that look like, Rena? What's that about?
Thank you so much, Maria. And here's an interesting thing. So, this whole series that we have set up under TBQ Live is talking about the science and art. And I think so what you've just heard Maria talk about is the science, why bias actually exists. Now, here's the interesting thing. So we know as a human being, as a species, it is a mechanism that has been created by our brain. So we can't really fight it. And the problem is that why people start fighting it, because even the word bias has got a judgment behind it. It's seen as something negative. The fact is, some people might have unconscious biases which are which are positive, which might be making them far more collaborative, which might make them much more compassionate and kind, might make them more innovative, might make them more resilient. So the point is that there is a bias that exists in all of us as a species level. And for a moment, what we're inviting people to do is, when you're looking at this topic, keep the judgment aside, understand it's something which is vitally important for us to survive as a species, but understand that there might be tripwires around it, and therefore we need to know how to navigate it. This point itself that Maria has talked about, which is the iceberg. Now, I'm sure everyone who is listening to this live, or for that matter, hearing the recording, has heard about the iceberg model. You have to just Google it, and there will be many, many visuals that will come up for you. The interesting bit is that often, and I'm not saying it because I have spoken with every organization, but if you read some of the literature that has been talked about the pros and cons of unconscious bias, the way that it is actually being used in organization is very superficial. Typically, it's a topic that might be included in a induction training of a half a day of an hour on diversity and inclusion. So they're just talking about the concept. But that doesn't help us really talk about those underlying, underneath surfaces, as Maria was talking about, that we're not even aware of, right? In a 1 hour diversity inclusion training to kind of talk about, oh, we need to be aware about unconscious bias. So we need to dig a little deeper. And the example that we want to share with you, just to bring this concept to life, is actually, Maria, this was one slide of yours. Do you want to talk about that before I talk about a couple of examples?
Absolutely. That's so Thursday, isn't it, of me? And my apologies. This slide, the reason why I put this here is if we are unconscious and then we bring something into our consciousness, that means that we're sending biochemical energy down the wiring, which means that initially, when you raise awareness, you have this accidental backlash. People have actually said, well, we do unconscious bias, and suddenly everyone's being a lot more biased. And it's like, yes, because we're not that you're only looking at the tip of the iceberg. So the conclusion of that slide after the last slide was, if you only look at the tip of the iceberg, all you're going to raise is bias. That's why it's more important to have a look at where it comes from, why it's there, and how we can do something positive about it.
I think it's so well placed out there, Maria, because you've just underlined the topic even further to what we're talking about, going beneath the surface, beneath the tip of the iceberg. So here are 4 questions for you, which will make you aware about some of the biases that we all carry. And so this is a universal statement, but think about it. Now you can see 2 bits to the slide. You've seen the one on the right. This is a visual that's often shared in the whole thing about brain imagery and visual perceptions. Do you see a rabbit or do you see a duck? And the chances are that each one of us get drawn towards one particular image, and then you have to try, and then we see the other image because the question says that there's another thing out there. Or somebody might need to point out to us to show the rabbit or the duck, right? And that's really giving you a depiction about how bias works. Because biases are actually filters. They help us visualize the world in an efficient way, because as Maria was talking, we don't have time to kind of interpret every event in every dimension, in every second. So it's reacting from a filter system, which are your under the surface filters and values and beliefs. So think about it. What are your values? So for example, if a person has a value of honesty, let's presume so, there might be many, then they will always be biased in case they find that they feel that somebody is dishonest. It might be how they're looking or what they said. And so their reaction might be the person is being dishonest, right? So values, what are your values would be a question that I would ask somebody to really help them understand what their biases might be, because they are our filters. Values are something that are filters and belief system that make us who we are. And it gives us our place in understanding our own system of operating within this world. And hence it becomes important to understand the values or your strengths. What are your natural strengths would be another question that I would ask you. Natural strengths are something that we are all good at doing. And some of us are aware about our strengths and some are not. I'm a Gallup certified coach, and I know Maria and I work in a program called the Unplenary where we talk about the Strengths Finder. The interesting thing is that typically every individual has about 10 to 12 dominant themes. I've trained more than 1,000 people, and I know I myself went through it about 15 years ago. People are generally aware only about 3 or 4, so the other are beneath the surface. So they're not even aware about. But the question is, do you know what your strengths are? Because that makes us think that we like certain behaviors in other people or working styles in other people and not in other people. So if you're a great arranger, we like it when other people are being arranged, a good arranger. But if there's somebody who's a little chaotic and messy, a bias might creep in there. Or think about cultural backgrounds. I mean, there's so much talked about that I don't need to ask, but really to raise awareness about that. What does my cultural background make me? What is my belief system that creates a certain bias, which might be good or not so good, but just to bring in that awareness. That's what we're talking about. And what are the other beliefs that you have that are creating a certain kind of a filter for you? And the value of these trainings, when if you're doing a training which is going beneath the surface, is when people in a room share each other's values, strengths, cultural background, beliefs, the understanding and awareness goes up many layers and multifold. And that's the beauty. So not only does the individual benefit, the team benefits, the organization benefits. So that's really what we're talking about when we say, when you're talking about unconscious bias, don't make it a 5 or 10 minute or half an hour topic. Really go deep, because then the value can be absolutely immense. So that's the first one. The second one that we want to talk about is awareness. So awareness is important, right from the surface to beneath the surface. But once you're aware about it, you really need to work around behavioral change, right? So I know that I have my biases, for example. Now I might need to change my behavior so I do not get irritated with somebody who's messy and chaotic because I have a higher ranger, or because somebody is going against my value system or cultural background, or whatever the underneath the surface awareness that has come up for an individual. But you need to be able to change your behavior so you don't react in that particular way. And that's where the subject of neuroplasticity comes in. So let's again touch upon the science of unconscious bias, and then I'll move into the application of it. So, Maria, over to you.
Okay, neuroplasticity. Probably found out, discovered probably about 30 years ago by now. And the thing, we always believed that actually once you kind of got to be an adult, your brain was pretty much wired, and that's how you were. That's why people believe that if you tested for an IQ, your IQ would kind of stay there. With the advances of fMRI technology and all the different imaging technologies, we now know that the brain is constantly making new connections. New neural pathways are constantly being forged. So actually, you know, there's the definition. It's the ability of the brain to form and reorganize synaptic connections. The thing about that is we do that all of the time. Where we can leverage that skill and actually make it intentional, that's where we now start the process of behavioral change. Once you've looked at the surface, once you've looked underneath the surface, you know, and to come back to a point that Rena made, values are where we shoot all of our behaviors through. What we value is how we act in the world, usually unconscious. The great thing about neuroplasticity is once we have looked above and below the surface, we then get the opportunity to change, because we can actually change our wiring, which changes our behaviors, our thinking patterns, and what we actually do and how we impact other people. And I think I could go for days about how amazing the brain is, but in real terms, this is what I consider one of the most awe-inspiring functions in the brain. We get to change if we pay attention. The thing being, one of the things that Rena and I are speaking about here is look at what's going on the surface, become aware of what's going on underneath the surface, because once you become aware, that's where you can put in neuroplasticity. I need to know what I want to change before I can change it. Once I know what I want to change, my brain takes 66 days to make a new neural pathway. So if you think about it, say you suddenly discover that actually one of my biases is I much prefer, I don't know, people who are left-handed because I'm left-handed. I have an affinity bias with that. Well, that's just plain silly. So it will only take me 66 days to become totally different about how I perceive people. That is a very neutral, doesn't make a huge impact example. But if you think about it, some of the impacts of bias can be very negative. I personally, and Rena has spoken to this, biases can be great or they can be negative. It's usually the impact of the bias that's negative, not always the bias itself. We're bound to have biases of, gender or friends, etc., that's okay. But if the impact is negative, then it's really important to know which particular capacity we're going to do to change it, and that's neuroplasticity. To know that your brain can totally change your behaviors, your ways of thinking, your perceptions. I think that's amazing. So that's what we use to start this process of, we brought it into awareness, this is how we change it.
And I find this so fascinating. Every time I listen to this whole concept about the brain changing, it's so fascinating, Maria. I love it absolutely, the way that you explained it out. And here's the interesting thing, and I think so another point is that Maria and I have often felt that when we talk with our clients and in our training programs about neuroplasticity or applied neuroscience, light bulbs, eyes light up, because it's like, oh, I now know how to change my behavior because I know how my brain works. It's like, the code, so now you can make the code or break the code or whatever way you want to talk about it. So really what we're trying to tell you right now is that trying to share with you right now is that when we're talking about behavioral change, it is actually understanding that what you're trying to do is change a neurological pathway. But let's go a little bit deeper into the science behind it, because this is something which is really powerful for any behavioral change, but certainly why it's important for biases as well. So here's a very simple concept. So stay with me for a couple of minutes while I explain this concept to you. So just as Maria was talking about, is that there's a reaction that takes place and then there's an action that happens, right? So we all as human beings need energy to get things done. All behaviors and actions are an energetic response, which is actually triggered by a chemical reaction. And that chemical reaction actually results in two kinds of responses, what we call the anabolic and the catabolic. The anabolic is chemicals such as dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin. Catabolic, they're chemicals such as adrenal and cortisol. There are two different reactions that take place triggered by different parts of the brain, which is what Maria was also referring to, is when so there's a part of the brain called the amygdala, and we know that there's a part of the brain called the PFC, or the prefrontal cortex, or as Maria says, this part of the brain, and she keeps pointing out to it. Now, as you can see on the slide, that the reactions are different and the emotions that we experience are different. So you know that you're experiencing catabolic when you're experiencing anything in that red box, which is anger, apathy, self-doubt, guilt, stress, those kind of emotions. And then you know that you're experiencing anabolic when there's passion, joy, happy, motivated, peace, or those kind of feelings. Now, remember, Maria talked about one thing about saying that why it becomes important for us to talk about unconscious bias, because typically they are a catabolic reaction. Because what's happening is at a very, very underneath the surface, remember, a lot of it is unconscious. Your brain or your amygdala is reacting. It's agitated because it's seeing something as a threat, because it's different. It's a different value system. It's a different cultural background. It's a different environment. It's a different working style. It's something which is different to me. So it's reacting at a very, very primal level, and it's a catabolic reaction that's taking place. And what's happening is that when you are having these feelings, so what I've changed in the slide is that the way it gets triggered off is that when you have this unconscious reaction, and you feel anger, for example, because you don't like somebody's working style, the brain then interprets within nanoseconds, it's milliseconds actually, it gives us the meaning. So it says, I don't like messy people. I don't like people who are from a different sectoral background. I don't think the person is like me, and hence I'm not going to select the person in an interview panel. I'm not going to promote that person because I'm not too, these are the thoughts, the interpretation that comes up because at an unconscious level, it's being triggered off, and therefore you're giving it certain meaning. Biases are exactly that, and which is why it's important. Not just because of the way that it affects other people, but also when you experience a lot of catabolic energy, which is a lot of adrenal and cortisol, these are all stress-related chemicals, remember that. So what it does is that your well-being gets affected, one. Second, the person who's having bias and is having any of those three reactions at an amygdala level, which is to the fight, flight, freeze, or to reject a concept or an individual, or ignore it, or attack or rebel or fight against it, when you are having that kind of a reaction, only those three choices are available to the individual. You will either reject, attack, attack or ignore or fight, flight, freeze, which means as a leader, when you are having your biases, or an individual, when you have these biases, then what happens is that your choices get limited, which is why I will hire a person who's like me, which is why I will reject a person who's messy, just on some of those examples that we were talking about, just to play out the point that I'm sure is becoming very, very clear to you. So it's not only that deeper level awareness, but then making people aware about these filters and helping them understand what is creating that catabolic or anabolic reaction. And that's when once you start understanding it, that's when you can start creating a new neurological pathway, because you understand that the current way of thinking or interpretation is actually bias, which is limiting your choices, and therefore you need to interpret it in a different way, and hence you learn the art of neuroplasticity. And what we talk about is that really, apart from the cultural, the values, the different belief systems, another good kind of a thing for you to take away from today's conversation is think about your GAILs. So the GAIL stands for, the GAIL stands for certain things, and I'm going to very quickly relay it out to you. G is the gremlin, the little voice inside us, which is a critic, which says that we must be perfect. A is an assumption. Because something happened somewhere in the past, we think it might happen again. Interpretation is the way that we interpret the world because of our value systems, our backgrounds, our choices, our strengths. L is the limiting beliefs that exist within the world, and that's what we make it into our belief system. And any of the GAILs is what results in a catabolic reaction. So watch where the biases might be lying within the GAILs itself. Now, I know that this is an entire program, so the way that we actually work on it is to help people become aware of their thoughts, because when they become aware of their thinking, which is the conscious and the unconscious, and they change their thinking process, they will change the chemical reaction in the body. And the minute you have the anabolic energy, choices beyond the fight, flight, freeze will open up, which makes me far more accommodating, innovative, coming up with new ideas, which is what we're all looking for. And hence what we're saying is that if you do not address unconscious bias, that's what you as an individual or as an organization are missing out on. Now, the program that we actually provide to people is a 5-part training program, because as you're beginning to understand, it's quite deep, but that's what is required, is that if you do not go deep on this topic, how are you going to benefit from it? And chances are that people are not benefiting from it in the world right now. It's because they're not going into the depth. Because in our program, what we do is make people aware of their default biases that exist in life, that is helping us make judgment calls, which might be limiting or liberating, recognizing how these filters are impacting their choices and decision making really into their day-to-day life as leaders, as individuals, and then helping them choose new interpretation, practice and experiment those new interpretations, and change their choices in action. That is the process, ladies and gentlemen, that really helps you experience what Maria so beautifully talked about, which is neuroplasticity. I'm just going to pause and take a breath there and ask Maria for a couple of comments before we move on to the last part.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much. I always get so much out of hearing about GAILs, because it just reminds you about the fact that you will have that inner critique, that you will have limiting beliefs. And, one of the points that is so vital when it comes to unconscious bias is if we are in the fight, flight, or freeze, my field of vision narrows physically, but also psychologically. So it's so important to throw the data out and say, well, actually, this unconscious bias training's not working, so we're not going to do it. It just means that actually we haven't got it right yet. But let's face it, as a species, we evolve, we get more understanding, we get more deeply into a topic, and then we know that actually that first process, it's essential, but it's not the only process that's going to bring that change about. And I think that's what's really important. And that's why Rena and I, who are so passionate at supporting leaders and having everyone be the best leader that they can possibly be, is let's not fall at the first challenge. Let's not fall at that first hurdle. And I think it's so important, when the BBC are going, well, actually, we're not training this anymore because it didn't have the impact. And it's like, okay, but that doesn't stop your organization now limiting its psychological choices. It's limiting all of that amazing diversity and inclusion, that together we are better. There's a huge amount of research that says you have a diverse team, you have people who work in different ways, see things in a different perspective. Your team is stronger, it's more agile, it's more robust, and it's more resilient. And the last point I really need to make, Rena, everyone's brain wiring is as unique as their fingerprints. We need everyone's thinking to strengthen our thinking together.
Absolutely. So well said. So well said. And I think so that's the beauty of neuroscience. So I'm very conscious of time, because we do keep this 45 minutes and we're just going to step over by a couple of minutes just to tail off into the last bit of the third part that we'd like to put forward. But before that, I just want to kind of say that the BBC point, so BBC has now actually changed around, and they are going to have everyone go through unconscious bias training. So it's absolutely amazing to see that they're going to invest. It's an announcement that's taking place this year. So it's absolutely delightful to see that they're, until unless they've changed it, so I'm not aware of that. But I think they are going to be going through unconscious bias training. Okay, so we've talked about one aspect, but the other bit that we want to put down, which is very important, I'm literally going to run through it as a 30-second, because you are experts and you understand this, because this comes under the wider arena of reframing diversity and inclusion, is that training is not the answer. You need to make systemic changes, and the systemic changes takes place across a plethora of areas. And you can see on the slide, it's right from the processes, right from how you're exhibiting yourself to the outside world. It's your internal talent processes that are taking place, how projects are given to people, what kind of debates and forums are taking place with external organization to challenge the biases that leaders have internally, who's the devil advocate in your meeting, what's the leadership role modeling taking place. These are the systemic changes that need to take place, because you need to then, once people are making that behavioral change, we need to encourage them, we need to excite them, we need to remind them. And that's how you start benefiting from this topic, which is so much ingrained in all of us, and we can't run away from it. So what is it? Our final pitch really to all of you. 3 points, just as a recap. It's an iceberg when you're talking about unconscious bias. Please focus on the surface and below the surface awareness. Be aware of the gales, because that's what is triggering off a lot of bias in all of us. It's not just about awareness, it's about behavioral skills and equipping people with skills and tools on how to do that. We talk about the 5-part program that we do, which combines neuroplasticity and the core energy coaching process. And of course, last but not least, the systemic changes, so that we can encourage, remind new behaviors and new skills. That's what we're really talking about in today's conversation. I'm going to wrap up today's TBQ Live. Thank you so much for joining Mariana and me. We have had a great time just having this conversation.
We have.
We welcome your views, your ideas, your comments. Please do give us a shout on the comment box, or indeed drop us an email on LinkedIn. We'll be back on the 20th of July. We're going to try out a new timing, 8 a.m. London time, and we're going to pick up one of the other 9 levers from the book, The Brilliance Quotient. Thank you so much for being with us. Bye for now.
Bye for now.